This is Stories of Impact, the art and science of human flourishing. In every episode, we travel the world to explore intersections of science and spirituality. I'm your host, writer Tavia Gilbert, and along with journalist Richard Sergey, every first and third Tuesday, we look through a new lens at old traditions, hear from new generations as they dream up innovative solutions, and learn new ways to make sense of modern life. I'm the daughter of two devoted public school educators, and returning to teach at the college where I earned my MFA proved to be one of the greatest joys of my life. It wasn't just the challenge and pleasure of helping students experience transformation. It was the tenderness and commitment, the love I felt for my students and for the entire college community that made my several years in higher education so enriching. Most anyone who goes into teaching pursues it from a heart of love, and that's certainly true for the two educators at the center of today's story. When Henry May began his career as a teacher, he learned that his job was not just about enriching the mind, but the soul and spirit of a student as well. He saw that part of excellence in education was helping students and school communities thrive, despite painful circumstances. He witnessed how traumatic life could be for the kids and the teachers, too.
I taught in a public school in South London. That was my first experience as a teacher. I taught in a very challenging inner city school. One of my students was sent to jail for murder. Another one of my students was murdered. And the context of the school was one of a lot of violence and a lot of suffering.
May had shifted his focus to educating educators when he was given an opportunity to design a teacher training program in Colombia. And he carried with him the experience of teaching kids in trauma. In 2013, he became a social entrepreneur, founding an innovative education program called Coschool. He wanted to be an educator who identified and solved problems that would help school communities thrive.
There's a paradigm which has been there for many years. The purpose of education has been understood as preparing humans to be productive members of society in an economic sense. What we need people to get good grades in their exams, to get qualifications so they can enter the employment market. A very capitalist understanding of education is to prepare people to add value to society. When people actually think about the most important parts of their education are often the moments where they develop their character. And the character strengths that they developed are the reasons they were able to flourish in their job, in their personal life, in their relationships, in many senses.
So what was unique about Coschool?
We connected schools, public schools and private schools. We brought together kids from different backgrounds, teachers from different backgrounds, which in a country like Colombia, a country with very stark inequality, is quite an unusual thing to do. And we found that bringing kids together, connecting schools for collaborative learning, was a pretty cool way for young people to learn about themselves, to learn about others, to learn about the world that they were living in, and to develop their character strengths.
Coschool Director of Education Nicole Bruskewitz was also a problem solver. The daughter of two teachers, after college, she started teaching English to adult immigrants, primarily Latin Americans, before working with immigrant children in Chicago public schools. The questions she had as an adult were the same questions that had nagged her as a child.
I was always really concerned about why some people had access to things in my community that other people didn't, and namely immigrant populations. Why do I, as a person who live in this town, have access to certain things that my neighbors don't? And that was something that I asked myself about my classmates from a very early age. So then I end up in bilingual education, not by chance, I don't think, but having a lot to do with these curiosities that began when I was a little kid.
A Rotary Foundation scholarship led Bruskewitz to Colombia, where she found her long-term home, her future as an educator, and her purpose at Coschool.
Both from my experience in Chicago public schools as well as my experience as a university professor here in Colombia showed me time and again that the biggest obstacle to learning is not the subject. It's the emotional content, and it's what the human beings are going through in their lives that permit them to learn or not, whatever it is that you're trying to teach. And so I think that adage about how teachers are psychologists, are nurses, are mothers, are friends, all of these hats that we have to wear as educators is what sort of got me curious about leaving language teaching and getting more into what I do now, which is social emotional education at Coschool. I jumped ship from a very cushy job in academia to work in a social enterprise, obviously not for the money and the perks, but for the cause, because I think it's something that is really at the heart of my purpose as a teacher, which is promoting human flourishing.
Both May and Bruskewitz were committed to the ideal that character development leads to human flourishing, and that character is at the heart of transformative education for every constituent in the school community, not just the students. May says,
character development is responsible for so much of life and for so many of the good things that humans do, but also of the less good things that humans do. The absence of good character often leads to terrible suffering, and the presence of good character often leads to human flourishing and humans fulfilling their potential. Developing the whole self, developing character, the development of your academic performance and so on should be the central purpose of education.
Bruskewitz adds,
character development as it relates to education has to do with nurturing human goodness. It is the most beautiful part of being an educator. You have a human being in front of you, and I believe deeply that every single human being has something to offer to the world, and they have a talent, and they have beauty inside them, and they have a seed of goodness that needs nurturing. Just like the task of being an educator is like being a gardener. How do you give that seed the soil it needs, the water it needs, the sunlight it needs to germinate and flourish in the end? For me, that's what character development is. It's bringing out that inner virtue that every human being has inherently. And I think what educators are tasked with is how to do that in the way that most honors the human being you have in front of you. And every human being is particular in the virtue and the good that they bring to this planet and this society. How can you, as educators, as school leaders, set up the conditions in which each student can flourish from their particular virtue and the particular good that they have to bring to the world? What we're trying to get at here is, what are the strategies, institutionally speaking, and at the classroom level, that teachers and school leaders can use to assure that flourishing happens in every child, every single one, because every single one has that brilliance to bring to the world.
In 2018, May and Bruskewitz were introduced to the pioneering work of Dr. Marvin Berkowitz and his primed model. Primed articulated and organized the values around education that they'd long believed in and which had guided their own leadership at Coschool.
The most important thing to understand about the primed model is that it's a collection of principles. It's not a dogma, it's not a recipe, it's not a methodology. They're principles to guide the design or redesign of schools so that schools become places where children flourish, so that schools become places where character education is at the center of education in its broader sense. And each of these principles is a lens to examine the school's values and practices in pro of character education.
Bruskewitz was inspired by the way Dr. Berkowitz thought about education and how education could be more effective and responsive to the needs of students.
Marvin always starts the Primed Institute and the trainings with a statement. Schools are perfectly designed for the results that they are obtaining. And if we don't like those results, we have to change the design. So the 6 principles help us with that redesign.
Bruskewitz describes the 6 pillars of the primed model.
Prioritization stands for putting character education at the center of the school's mission and vision. And prioritization involves things like not only redesigning the mission so that character education is at the center, but it has to do with allocation of resources, assigning stakeholders to this mission so that there's time and there's staff dedicated to this purpose, prioritizing activities around teacher training and space to have conversations about character. So prioritization is at the heart of the entire model. R for relationships, not just letting relationships happen at school, but intentionally cultivating them. Relationships between students, between adults and students, between adults, between families and the school. The relationships are a foundation for every other character skill that we might try to build in what we do in school practice. Intrinsic motivation, which we translate in Spanish also as interiorization, this is about doing the right thing, doing what's good when no one else is looking. So instead of basing our character education on extrinsic motivators, recognition, rewards, or punishments, we try to instill values in children. And so the interiorization of those values is what the intrinsic motivation principle is all about. Modeling is being the character that you want to see in other people. Character can be taught, but it can also be caught. So we can see that there's an explicit way of teaching character and an implicit way of teaching character. Kids learn from models. So adults have to be good models of character if we want kids to cultivate their character. The E for empowerment is about participatory pedagogy, giving children a voice in their education, putting their agency, their interests, and their capacity at the center of what we're doing in schools. And without that opportunity to be empowered, it's hard for them to explore their character strengths and virtues. And lastly, developmental pedagogy, which is about the fact that character development is a lifelong pursuit, and it's not something that's going to happen in the short term.
May and Bruskewitz thought that the primed model could be particularly transformative across Colombia's entire public education system. They wanted to explore what the positive impact would be if a systemic commitment to prioritization, relationships, intrinsic motivation or interiorization, modeling, empowerment, and developmental pedagogy were implemented at scale. And Colombia was uniquely suited for institutional redesign, they thought.
Colombia is a country that's just emerging from 50 years of civil conflict. Millions of people have been displaced internally. Millions of people in Colombia are victims of the conflict in one way or another. And although Colombia weirdly ranks high often in these happiness rankings, I think scratch beneath the surface, and Colombia is a country with a lot of collective trauma and a lot of mistrust over who your neighbor might be, mistrust over that political party, over that person from that region. In a country with a context like that, people, human beings, are even hungrier or have an even greater need for their basic human conditions to be met, which are conditions related to having relationships with other humans. So I think Colombia is a country that has a need and a desire for the development of individual and collective character strengths, particularly around connection to other people, particularly around the development of integrity and trust and so on, because those things have been lacking, or those things have been taken away from people unfairly over the last 50 years. And so Colombia is a hotbed of issues, but also we know that today Colombia is also a hotbed of activity and innovation in education around these topics.
Bruskewitz believed that the organizing principles of the primed model would enhance the work that she and May were already doing at Coschool.
The work that Coschool is doing, not only in terms of character education, but social and emotional skills, has everything to do with healing collective trauma and individual trauma. Things that we do, practices that are embedded in our culture as an organization and in every program that we do, which in this case is actually outside of the primed model. Things like emotional check-ins, genuinely asking people how they're doing and giving them an ear to express authentically how they're showing up. And this seems like a very small act to really care about what someone's going to say to you in answer to that question. How are you doing today? And we know that the typical response is fine. But if you dig a little deeper, it's usually not just fine. There's a lot more to the answer in that question. And that has everything to do with the work and the skills that we're trying to develop in the people that we work with. The capacity to recognize how you're doing, how you're feeling, and how those emotions impact the way that you treat yourself and that you treat other people. So I think skill number one, emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, emotional regulation. There's lots of names for what we do, but the gist of it is developing that consciousness has a huge role in healing your own emotional trauma and healing collective trauma. There's a huge emotional component that has a lot of corollaries in your mental health, in your physical health, in your behavior toward other people. And I think that takes us to the next dimension of the other skill that we really work on in our programs that I think is transformative for every single person that we work with, without exception, which is, how do I relate to other people? Am I capable of listening actively? Can I connect with what another person is feeling? Can I understand the implications of my actions on another person? And all of this comes back to empathy. And in a society where trust has been damaged, where neighbors have become enemies, and where violence and conflict was the gold standard for decades, for some people for their entire lifetime, coming back to the most basic thing, which is how you can relate empathically to another human being, is key to peace building.
May and Bruskewitz decided to helm a research study introducing Primed into public schools. They dreamed of reaching hundreds of schools and entire cities across Colombia and beyond, educating, promoting character development, and helping heal collective trauma. In order to spread the values, skills, and pedagogy that had made Coschool so transformative and implement the primed model at scale, May and Bruskewitz first needed to build trust with the educators and leadership of Colombia's public schools. That meant being honest about how they and their efforts could be perceived.
We wondered a lot about the translation of this model to the Latin American context and how easy it would be to not only translate it to the Spanish language, but translate it culturally. Nonetheless, the principles are universal in their application. And I think that has been a pleasant surprise. Whereas we've had to translate some of the examples and definitely the language to Colombia, the notions and the ideas that are at the heart of the model really do work here. Because I really do think that human character does have a lot of universal ingredients that are not particular to language or culture. And that helps me in some way explain my reason for being here. What are you as a North American doing trying to transform education in Latin America? Go back to your country and take care of your own house first. And our own house is the house of humanity. And I think that's been what's beautiful in terms of a lovely surprise in how Primed has translated to Latin America.
That spirit of humility and service allowed the Coschool team to gain the support and buy-in of educational leaders who agreed to participate in the research project. They launched their study, taking Primed into 10 public schools in the city of Bogota. With at least 2,000 students per school, they reached tens of thousands of students. But their work didn't actually start with the students. Rather, they knew that
you need to find a way to break into the heart of the leader of the school. Leaders in Colombian schools, most of them got into their jobs because they care deeply about children and education and character education and social emotional development of their students. But many of them, in becoming administrators of schools, their focus shifts onto more administrative elements of the schools, and they often become detached from that original purpose that drew them into their jobs and into education. And so what we found is that Primed is a beautiful experience for them to reconnect with their purpose. It begins with the school leaders embracing a change of mindset, about transforming the adult leadership team within the school and working with the teachers and the other adults in the community. But it's down to that leadership team and the leader in particular taking on the challenge of transforming themselves, transforming their team, and transforming their schools.
How did May and Bruskewitz lay the groundwork for those transformations?
Probably the most powerful question is, to what extent are we being the models of character that we want to see in our students? And so you can't do this kind of reflecting when you're in the thick of the insanity that it is a school day. The first activity that we do in the program with these leadership teams is take them out into the Colombian countryside, into a beautiful farm-esque setting situated in the mountains in nature and away from their schools, most importantly. It's a group of 5 to 7 school leaders together as a team. And we have a 3-day retreat in which we delve into these questions of what is the purpose of education? How do we nurture human flourishing in children? Is our school properly designed to do that? And if the answer is no, what do we need to start to rethink? Probably the most powerful question is, to what extent are we being the models of character that we want to see in our students? And so you can't do this kind of reflecting when you're in the thick of the insanity that it is a school day. Putting out fires, attending to disciplinary problems, dealing with parents, holding meetings with your teachers. The day is packed and there's just no time for this sort of transcendental reflection about the purpose of what you're doing and looking at the day-to-day actions in a critical, reflective way.
That bonding opportunity and the space to think, plan, and dream give school leaders a chance to reconnect with their original passion as educators.
Once that head teacher is on board, once they've had that moment of vulnerability in front of their leadership team and they've said, look, I'm not being the type of leader I want to be, but I want to change and I want your help because I want to get better and I want to be a good model of character for you and for my students. The way schools can transform when that happens is just, it's amazing.
The teams need ongoing support and structure to have any chance of facilitating that amazing transformation.
The school leadership teams walk away with minds blown and a lot of inspiration. Then what happens? Then they go back to their school and they realize that everyone else at school wasn't at this retreat for 3 days. And they come into contact with the challenge of, how do we get our teachers and the rest of our school community, including staff, on board with this newfound sense of purpose and these reflections that we're having around what we're shining in, but also what we need to reform in terms of the way we're doing things at our school. So second activity in the project is doing this strategic planning, which heavily involves bringing on other members of the school community into this reimagining of the school with character education as a central priority. And these plans are very unique. Each school decides on certain things that they want to prioritize and actions that they want to take because each school culture is different. And each school has strengths and opportunities for improvement that are distinct.
So May and Bruskewitz made a long-term commitment to participating school leadership teams.
We meet with them on a monthly basis to see how their plans are going and troubleshoot. And it's not easy because what we're talking about here is creating a cultural shift. And culture change is hard and it takes time and it can be very frustrating. And so having sort of an outside third party, which is the role that Coschool plays in this, to bounce ideas off of, to troubleshoot, to navigate the friction that is part of cultural change is a key point in this implementation.
With Coschool's support and leaders willing to be vulnerable and expansive, powerful, sustainable, systemic cultural change could happen.
The intervention focuses on working with school leaders directly, but we know that it has to trickle down to impact students. That's the final objective. So we hope to see in the first phase transformations in the school leaders and their own reflections about their character and their practice as leaders. But then this should trickle down into how teachers behave, how teachers are carrying out their classroom practice, the teacher's own character, and eventually to the students and broader school community. So we start at the top and we hope that the changes are trickling down and that this permeates the entire school culture and all of the stakeholders or members of that school community.
What were the results of their study of the impact of primed? Were there any surprises?
Sometimes you might have a bias or a preconception that the older and more experienced head teachers might be more resistant to change. They've been doing things a certain way for 20 or 30 years. It's worked well enough for them. They're coming to the end of their career. And what we found is actually some of the most wonderful stories of transformation have come from the elder members of the tribe going, all right, this is interesting. I don't mind trying to change, or I'm open to new ideas. It may be a surprise to some, this idea of public schools and private schools, that some people say, oh, of course, private schools are miles ahead on stuff like this. And actually, material wealth or in income of families or what schools have isn't always a great indicator or that connected to what's going on in terms of character development. It's not a very good indicator of whether a school is a place where children are flourishing and where character is a priority, if it's a private school or a public school. We've seen private schools with real issues around this topic, and we've seen public schools that have so many great initiatives going on and so much positive energy dedicated towards character development.
We've seen positive changes around this construct of school well-being, which takes into account things like social and emotional education, attention towards elements of mental health and psychological well-being of students, school safety, inclusion, things that contribute to a broader climate that is inclusive and conducive to human flourishing. Aside from the quantitative data that we're collecting, we're also doing case studies about each one of the schools, because each school is a story and it's its own universe. And each story has some kind of transformation that's worth talking about. In some cases, it's the transformation in the school principal's mindset. In others, it's a story of student empowerment, students taking on a role as mentors, older students to younger students. There's this program called Jiminy Cricket at one of the schools where the older students are becoming mentors to the younger students, but after having had the adults being mentors to them. And you see this beautiful sort of cascade from top down in school leaders walking the talk to the youngest students in the schools walking the same talk. And each of these schools has one of these amazing stories of transformation that has nothing to do with the numbers that measure how the school climate has evolved through the course of this implementation. It has so much more to do with how the human beings have changed as a result of this happening in their school. The other pleasant surprise for me has been the level of creativity that the schools have shown in translating PRIME, because half of the schools can't pronounce the acronym well, which I think is perfect because it pushes them to come up with their own language and their own manner of expressing and understanding the principles that the model proposes. And each school has appropriated the model and expressed it and translated it in a very local and grounded way. And I think I've been just pleasantly entertained even by that creativity that the schools have used in translating that model to their local context.
The project has not just been as transformative for the school community as the team had hoped. It's been profoundly moving for Bruskewitz.
We're seeing in schools practices like restorative justice practices that are school-based as a great example of this. This goes beyond just me understanding how you feel and how my actions make you feel, but into mechanisms that schools are teaching, starting with school leaders and teachers, but all the way down to students as mediators of these circles of restorative justice, which have as their key ingredients empathy, active listening, conflict resolution as key skills. And so you're seeing as a widespread trend in Colombia peace building skills being taught in school, children facilitating conversations to resolve conflicts between themselves. And it is beautiful and it is astounding. And it gives me a lot of hope that the new generation of Colombians is going to be equipped with these skills, which have taken priority precisely as a result of the history of this country. I'm just impressed and moved every time I see it happening in schools. Little kids, 10-year-old kids, sitting in a circle and mediating conflict between their peers. And they are so graceful and so capable of holding this space and mediating these conversations. And it's really just impressive to watch.
May also sees the beauty and power of a school designed around community, connection, and character virtues. That's education based on nurturing the best of humanity.
Connection with other people is vital for our health, for our well-being. A sense of belonging, feeling like I belong to somewhere, I belong to a community, I'm appreciated, I can add value, I can be part of something bigger than myself. A sense of autonomy, self-worth, I am a valuable person and can add value to my community, to my country.
We hope you'll come back in 2 weeks for another new episode. In the meantime, please share the Stories of Impact podcast with someone you think would love it. And we'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch at storiesofimpact.org. This has been the Stories of Impact podcast with an interview by Richard Sergey. Written and produced by Tavia Gilbert for Talkbox Productions. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Executive producer Michelle Cobb. The Stories of Impact podcast is generously supported by Templeton World Charity Foundation.